Today I'm going to be taking a look at a couple of mini record formats from the 1960s, starting with this one, Hip Pocket Records. Now these were introduced in the US in 1967 by Philco Ford. The Ford motor connection here has nothing to do with these being used in cars, it's just that in the early 1960s Ford Motor Corporation bought Philco, and for a while Philco products were branded as Philco Ford. I bought some of these Hip Pocket records quite a while ago, but I've been holding off featuring them in a video until I acquired one of the special mini record players that was designed to play them. So I'm going to show you that later, although these discs are able to be played on most normal record players. A Hip Pocket record is a flexi disc, it's just under 4 inches across, it's got a track on either side, and it's played at 45 RPM. As you can see, these originally cost 69 cents, and just like the hit clips that I featured, these were aimed at a younger audience than your traditional record buyer. At the time of the launch, Philco Ford also introduced a couple of mini record players, as well as the ability to play Hip Pocket records. They could also play the normal 45s and LPs as well. Let's look at the case for launching Hip Pockets though. I've got this special introductory pack, and on the reverse it lays out the marketing pitch for the discs. So if we start off with the first point, buy the hits you missed. Yes, it's important to mention Hip Pockets weren't your current hits that were in the charts. They contained songs that had already been a hit. These records were licensed from the various record labels for what was effectively a delayed re-release on this new format. The next point down mentions how 25 to 50 of these records could be carried in a pocket or purse, or you could mail them with a greeting card. Well, I agree they are certainly a lot thinner and lighter than a normal 45. When I got this pack delivered, at first I thought I'd been sent an empty envelope, but no, there are 6 discs in here. The remainder of the points are mostly about the resilience of these things, and it's intended that these should appeal to a younger crowd who might be a little bit rougher in handling these than someone would with a normal record. Of course, from the position of the record industry, these were being pitched as a way to make music appeal to a wider age group. 50 million kids, as it mentions on this trade advert. This article from a HiFi magazine explains the numbers behind the reasons for aiming a product at this youth market. Apparently, at this time, 6,000 new 45s were released each year, but 50% of sales were made up from the top 100 records. 70% of sales overall came from teens and pre-teens, and 45 RPM record sales were worth $224 million a year. Now, of course, I can't play you more than a couple of seconds of these things, but I can confirm that they do sound just fine. Perfectly listenable. I'm not completely on board with one of the advertising claims though, but it should be said that I'm looking at this from the position of someone 50 odd years after this came out. So the advertising stated that each of the 2 numbers they put on a Hip Pocket record had made it big, sold maybe 1 million copies or more. It said they were still getting big play on the air and kids were screaming for them, but they couldn't find them on 45s anymore, and that's where Hip Pocket records came in. Well, I'm no expert in late 1960s music, but from my perspective it seems that all the records I have seem to fall into the category of having one big hit and one lesser known track. For example, I've heard Aretha Franklin's version of Respect, of course, but I've never heard Soul Serenade, and the same goes for sweet soul music that's backed with You Don't Have to See Me. So I did a bit of Googling to find out what really was on the B-side of, for example, Woolly Bully, and it wasn't Juju Han, though those were separate singles, but it was worth noting that Woolly Bully had come out in 1965, and these discs came out in 1967, and still at 69 cents they were the same price as a normal 45 single in 1967. Oh, and there's one other issue with the small format. It didn't work with automatic return record players, as the whole disc fits within the label area on a normal record, well past the run-out groove that would trigger the auto return. Also, as mentioned on the packaging, you can't stack them, which was a very popular way to listen to singles at this time. So let me spell this out. You are getting asked to pay full price for a record that's gone out of the charts, on a format that has decent sound quality but not as good as a normal 45, and that won't play on some record players, and that can't be stacked. Needless to say, sales weren't great, and just 6 months after launch, Philco Ford were conducting, quote, price sensitivity tests in 20 stores across the country, and found that, surprise, surprise, if they reduce the price from 69 cents to 39 cents, they sold more. Wow, these guys are geniuses. So the 1968 price of Hip Pockets, or HPs, as they were trying to get people to call them by this point, became 39 cents. But one thing that's noticeable from this advert is that most of the records featured here are the same ones they launched with, and this is 6 months after launch. It seems they were struggling to get new music out on this format. So what's the weakest idea you could think of to drum up sales of a floundering format? I bet it's not as bad as this one. How about pretending that kids could wear them as earrings? Yes, in a quote, wild new national advertising campaign to grab the fad-happy young gals, they were promoting a set of earrings that could hold 20 HPs. And don't they just look comfortable, practical and stylish? Hip pockets failed hard and ended up in closeout deals like this one. For $13.88 you get 50 45 RPM records, 5 hip pockets and 1 hipster record player. That was one of the miniature models that was designed to be sold alongside the HPs. Now notice how the 5 hip pocket records are pack-ins in the box with the record player. So those are just the ones you would have got if you'd have bought the player. They had to throw in the normal 45s just to shift the stock of these. It's a bit of a sad end, but also thoroughly deserved. Now, while we're talking about mini records, I thought I should just do a quick mention of the 8-band, the 2004 mini record format from Bandai. You might have seen a video I did about that back in 2017. That video was a bit of a hit. It got 1 million views in the first year. And by some amazing coincidence, in 2019, Crosley just out of the blue decided for no reason to bring back this format that had been dead for 15 years and pretty much everyone had either forgotten about or weren't aware of in the first place. Just after that video came out. Just a coincidence? Nothing to see here. Let's move on. But seriously, the only reason I mentioned these records is to compare them against 1967's Hip Pocket. Hip Pockets were double-sided flexi discs. 8-band, or whatever Crosley are calling them now, are one-sided hard plastic and have a non-standard size spindle hole. And as its name suggests, it's 8 centimetres in diameter. That's about 3 inches, where the Hip Pocket is 3 7/8 inches, that's hard to say, and about 9.5 centimetres across. Now, I mentioned earlier how well the Hip Pocket can be played on many normal record players. I only really wanted to feature it when I got some hardware to show alongside it. Well, I was surprised to find a device that looked like it could play them for sale on a Japanese auction. It's this, and just look at that funky font. Now, I assume that's going to be pronounced as Barclaytophone. Barclaytophone. Anyway, let me get it out of the box. It looks barely used. The name Barclaytophone, I can't say it, I don't know how you're supposed to say it, makes slightly more sense when you see the device itself because it comes from a company called Barclay. On one side there's a headphone socket and a start-stop button, a volume which is also the on-off switch, and a speed selector, while on the other side there's a DC power jack. The lid on the front hinges up to reveal a tiny record platter, just big enough for one of the sub 4-inch records, but nothing greater. On the Japanese auction it was advertised as junk because it was untested due to the fact the battery connectors were corroded. It did come with one gold-coloured disc, which looked on the pictures to resemble a Hip Pocket record, although some kind of Japanese variant that played at 33 1/3 RPM. But as far as dimensions go, they're identical. So now I had to see whether or not I could get this unusual record player up and running and playing my Hip Pocket records. I didn't have a suitable power adapter or even know the configuration of the positive and negative, so I decided that I'd tackle a corrosion in the battery compartment instead. One thing I noticed was that it wasn't even possible to get all 4 batteries into the compartment. The top row just didn't have enough space to slide in without getting stuck under the plastic. Now, I've seen this happen before with alkaline batteries. Sometimes they're a fraction larger than a non-alkaline. So I got some really old batteries to test for size, and those got stuck too. So it looks like I'm going to have to shave a fraction off the inside of the compartment just to make enough room for the batteries to fit in. Now, I didn't realise at the time, but I should have really flipped it over before opening it up, because opening it upside down means that the tone arm fell off, but it enables you to have a quick look at it. You can see that it's got a weight on one end, and there's a section on the other that's supposed to locate below the turntable. Now, pressing the button on the side of the machine pushes against that lower section and raises or lowers the arm onto the record. It's a very simple mechanism. There's no belts inside here. The turntable itself is made out of rubber and it's spun by a motor which makes contact with one edge. I set about cleaning the corrosion off the battery connectors. It had no doubt come from a leaky battery, which shows that this has been used before. I also sanded off a fraction of a millimetre of the plastic from the battery compartment. It only took a couple of minutes, and then it was time for a test. I popped the batteries back in, stuck the record on, and nothing, not a sausage. So then I was just taking the batteries back out again and spotted a brief movement of the turntable. It turned out that if I held the batteries at a certain angle, I could get it to play. So that was great news. It's just the battery contact. So I needed to pull out a wire brush and spend a bit more time on those connectors to make sure they really were spotless. And I was happy to see that after doing that, it was back to full working order. And the tone arm even auto-returns at the end of the side. So it was then time to put the cover back on and check the batteries fitted without any issue, which they did. They were a little bit tight perhaps, but I don't want them too loose, just loose enough to get them in and out of the compartment and close the lid. So yes, in operation, it's a very neat little device. You turn it on with a volume control, you press one button which drops the arm, plays the whole record, then auto-returns at the end and turns the turntable off. Now, I wasn't sure whether it was designed to be played whilst being carried, and the answer is no, not really. The record will skip. It's much better to put it down on a surface when it's in operation. Now, given the age of the components and the drive mechanism, it's a little bit wobbly, but if the speed's out, you can adjust that with a couple of pots that are accessible through holes in the bottom of the case. So now, time to try a hip pocket record. So put the disc in and then swap the speed to 45. Press start, and a few seconds later, it's supposed to be played with the lid closed, as you can hear. That's because the top of the lid contains a spring-loaded cone that pushes down onto the record and spins, and that keeps that record in contact with the rubber platter. So that was going to be the end of this video. I'd shown my hip pocket records being played on a piece of period equipment, but then that would have left a lot of unanswered questions. I mean, where does the Barclaytophone fit? Where does it fit into this story? I mean, as far as I was aware, hip pocket records only came out in the US, and yet this hip pocket player has French labelling. And hip pockets were only 45, and yet this has dual speeds, and also came with a 33 1/3 record that contained Japanese music that isn't branded as hip pocket. And who the heck is Barclay, and where do they come into this? So let's try to unravel this whole thing. Well, first off, Barclay. Well, that's too common a name just to do a Google search on its own. But Barclay record players, well, that brought up nothing as well. The word Barclaytophone just brought up the device that I'd bought. I could see the Yahoo auction I'd bought it from, and a Twitter post from the Yokohama pickers who had found the thing in the first place that I'd bought. The only link that they could find was to a new old stock one for sale from a company called HiFi Vintage, but their website contained no additional information. Then there's the whole mystery of it having French labelling and yet being manufactured and found in Japan. Now, of course, I'm used to products that were made just for the Japanese domestic market having either all or some of their labelling in English or using a mix of English and Japanese. It's commonplace, but I'd never seen French used like this. So I put a question out to the people on Patreon who I knew had lived in Japan or had more experience over there to see if they'd ever seen French labels on electronic products. And the answer came back as no. It seemed like this product was probably supposed to be sold in France. So then I concentrated my attention on searching for a French connection with records and the name Barclay. And all roads led to Eddie Barclay. Eddie Barclay was a band leader who created his own record label. So rather than this being an electronics company, Barclay was a very prolific and well-known record label, just not well-known to me. And for some reason, the logo of the company was stuck on a mini record player that I bought from Japan. Now, as much as I searched, I couldn't find any connection between Barclay and hip pocket records. Well, other than one YouTube video where another chap demonstrated a Barclaytophone playing hip pocket records. But fortunately, he had the manual, and in the video he briefly showed a page where it mentioned putting the records on the player, and it called those records disques de poche, pocket discs. So a search on pocket discs then led me down the rabbit hole of another format entirely. Pocket disc, another 3 7/8 inch. Disc, a flexi-disc, but this one plays at 33 1/3. Now these are quite well documented online due to the fact a few Beatles pocket discs were issued. And just look at the price this one recently sold for, £500 plus £9.50 postage. I mean, come on, I think you could have ate the postage cost on that one. But anyway, what I have here wasn't designed as a hip pocket player. It was for pocket discs, but it was also backwards compatible with hip pocket. So let's do the story of pocket discs. Pocket discs were introduced to the trade press in May 1968 with a release date scheduled for September 68. According to Fred Hyman, the president of Americom, those were the creators of the pocket disc, they'd been working on these, they said, since 1962. That's long before hip pockets showed up on the scene. Now, I've got to say, there's something a bit fishy going on about all this. Perhaps some industrial espionage? I mean, two identically sized flexi discs turning up on the scene within a year of each other. It's like Deep Impact and Armageddon. But anyway, as we know from the earlier hip pocket story, by this point in 1968 they were floundering, but pocket discs had what seemed like a more enticing proposition. They were busy signing up record labels to the format so they could do a simultaneous release, day and date with the standard 45s. They were also going to sell pocket discs at 49 cents from countertop displays or for 50 cents from vending machines. The reason for the 1 cent difference is the vending machines took 2 quarters. Now, initially, they started a trial in Seattle. The vending machines they used were an adapted version of the ones that would have given out stamps. They were a mechanical sort, push-pull. They didn't need to be powered, so they could be sited anywhere. And during the trial, they proved to be very popular, far exceeding expectations and sales from the countertop units. Now, they extrapolated out the early sales from the first few weeks and predicted that nationally they could sell 200 million of these discs a year, or 400 million if they could get all the record labels to sign on. At this point, the sales of singles were starting to stagnate in the market as a whole, and pocket discs were seen as a bit of a potential saviour. A vice president from Capitol Records was very enthusiastic about the format, mentioning some of its benefits, for example, how they could press 9,300 an hour, and how he could hold 500 in a hand, or carry enough to service 50 accounts. So at this point, everyone seemed bullish on pocket discs, and it seemed set for success. But yet today, if you go on the Discogs website and have a look for pocket discs, you'll only find 33 entries. So what happened to all this early promise? Well, after installing 200 vending machines across 50 locations in Seattle, they then moved on to roll it out in Detroit as a strictly vending-only proposition. Now, this slow rollout was really disguising the fact that Americom just didn't have the money that would be necessary to take it nationally. So in April 1969, they sold the company to Novo Industrial, who they thought had the operation as well as the money to make it happen. Unfortunately, though, Novo immediately ran into financial difficulty and had to shed any part of the company that wasn't a sure moneymaker, so pocket disc production effectively stopped overnight. And the only people who ended up making any money out of pocket discs were those people who hung on to their Beatles records. Now, before the sale and before everything fell apart, Americom had commissioned Toshiba in Japan to make a special player for pocket discs called the Music Swinger, and apparently 2,000 of those were shipped to the US. And you can see this is a very similar machine to my Barclaytophone, although this one incorporated an AM radio as well. Now, I've yet to get to the Barclay connection to the pocket disc, or disc de poche as they would have called it. Well, this is an odd one, because Barclay in France had a range of records they called disc de poche. They were 6-inch discs, so an inch smaller than a normal 45, but they weren't flexi discs and they were played at 33 1/3. Each of these pocket discs contained 6 tracks, 3 on each side, and each track was edited down to just 2 minutes and flowed into each other like a mix. So, of course, these aren't the pocket discs you're looking for. You don't need to see our passes. They won't fit into a Barclaytophone. There were only a half dozen titles in this format, and they came out a year before the Americom pocket discs were introduced in the US. So this is just speculation. But could the fact that Eddie Barclay already used the pocket disc name have anything to do with the two companies coming into each other's radar? It's a heck of a coincidence if not. I mean, it's almost at the Crosley level of coincidence. But whatever it was that initially brought the two companies together, it was Barclay who were given the task of introducing the small pocket disc system into France. But I've been unable to find any evidence of Barclay actually releasing the discs there. If you've come across any French versions of these discs in the wild, then please let me know in the comments. However, the lack of French discs might explain why my machine that was seemingly destined for France was discovered in Japan. It seems quite likely that just as Toshiba were getting ready to ship a supply of their machines over, Eddie calls up and says to cancel the rest of the order because the Americans had messed up the whole launch and the record pressing plant had shut down, and therefore there were no discs to play on the machine, so there was no point sending the machines anymore. Now, there was a plan for Toshiba to launch Pocket Disc in Japan in 1969, but it seems they must have been left with an amount of unsold dead stock with French labelling and Barclay branding. But rather than throw away a perfectly good machine just because it's got the wrong text on it, it looks like they chose to sell them in Japan, hence a machine with French labels containing a Japanese disc. But then again, the catalogue numbers on this disc give me the impression that it was just the pack-in demo. Did these ever go out to the public? Was there ever any more records? I mean, who would buy a record player that only has one record for it? There's a few unanswered questions there at the end, but I hope you've enjoyed following me along on this journey through the world of 1960s pocket records. But that's it for the moment. As always, thanks for watching.